get started. Thanks everyone for coming. Appreciate your time on this busy Wednesday. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is John Capelli. I am the Vice President of On-Site Managed Services for Adecco Canada. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss a very important and very timely topic. Following today's presentation, we have reserved time to answer some of your questions. Any questions you may have during the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat, and then we'll address those when we get to the Q&A period. As many of you know, the infrastructure built around illegal labor practices is nothing new. Whether it be cash payments without tax remittances, misclassification of workers, or even escalating to the practice of human trafficking, it is a reality we've all encountered in one way or another. And although it's always been a hurdle and a strain on the reputation of all the legitimate staffing companies out there, never has it become so prevalent, so emboldened, and damaging as it has become in the past several years. Never have we seen so many of the most vulnerable in our society exploited and put at such great risk. And I'm sure we've all seen this escalating over the course of the pandemic and the pandemic recovery. This is why I'm thrilled to be speaking today about new legislation being introduced by the Ontario government, and it will directly address some of these issues. With us today is Nicolette Mueller, who is our VP of Legal Counsel and General Counsel of Adecco Canada. And she's been part of an access subcommittee advising MOL on the legislative changes and the actions required. So Nicolette, for those of us that have been working in the staffing world for many years, and even those who have the responsibility for contingent labor in their own businesses, we've been waiting for something like this for a long time. So I'm really interested to know, will this have the impact we need in order to drive the change required?
Thanks, John. I know that not everyone welcomes regulation and licensing, but we certainly do. I've been with Adecco since 2005, and it's been disheartening over the years to see the news reports of those unethical and illegal practices that you mentioned. From my legal vantage point, it's harmful in so many ways. First and foremost to workers who aren't getting their most basic employment standards met, but also to organizations who risk occupiers' liability and other claims if a worker who isn't given WSIB coverage, for example, gets hurt on their premises. And last but not least, it's given the whole industry a bit of a black eye. We've been lobbying the government for years for solutions to these issues. So last week's announcement of a licensing program has been a long time coming. So yes, I do think this will drive the change we're looking for. And the bonus? Until now, it was up to companies who used agencies to perform their own audits to ensure agencies were complying with all of their legal obligations. But now the government's taking this burden off organizations and actually taking a more active role to ensure agencies are legally compliant. I think those three stakeholders, employees who are sometimes vulnerable, clients who use agencies, and the whole industry comes out ahead with the regulation. The program is being rolled out. The program is being rolled out in two phases. First, effective July 1, the applications portal was launched along with regulations about how to apply, who has to apply, and what they need to do in order to apply. Applicants have 6 months to submit their applications, and then effective January 1st, 2024, licensing requirements kick in. As of January 1, 2024, those who are in scope of the legislation must be licensed. So who needs a license? Two groups of people or companies. The first are temporary help agencies. This term is defined in the Employment Standards Act. And it's defined as, I want to make sure I get this right, an employer that employs persons for the purpose of signing them out to perform work in a temporary capacity on a temporary basis for clients of the employer. This term is right in the Employment Standards Act right now. Recruiters are also in scope. Recruiters are any person who, for a fee, finds or attempts to find employment for prospective employees. And there's some exceptions here. The exceptions are internal recruiters for their own employer, educational institutions who help students find jobs, trade unions, registered charities, publicly funded organizations that support employment opportunities for those with developmental disabilities, and suppliers to the Ontario government or a municipality whose exclusive mandate is to support employment opportunities for Ontarians. 2 seconds. So you might wonder what the difference is between temporary help agencies, because they also recruit, and recruiters. But the intention is to cover off temporary staffing as well as agencies who recruit for direct hire by clients, what we call permanent recruitment or headhunting. I have to tell you, this licensing isn't simply a rubber stamping exercise. In fact, it's pretty intense. There's a whole list of items, but it includes things like submitting information about orders that have been issued under the Employment Standards Act, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act, and steps taken to comply with those orders. It includes information about whether the applicant has ever taken custody of an employee's passport or a work permit, which I'm sad to say is apparently a thing. It also includes information about whether an agency is up to date on its provincial and federal taxes, and whether the organization or any of its directors or officers have been involved in human trafficking. In my meetings with the Ministry of Labor, when we were discussing drafts of these regulations, I was horrified to learn how prevalent a problem this actually is. Finally, to address one of the most glaring problems is ensuring agencies have registered with the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, so that if there's ever an accident or an injury, a worker will be cared for and receive coverage. I don't know how many companies really understand the risks to themselves if someone on their premises is hurt. The whole point of our workers' comp structure is to provide insurance, both for the employee, but also the employer or the owner of the premises if someone gets hurt. Without that coverage, it's the owner who's on the hook. And if there happens to be a catastrophic injury, the costs are huge. You definitely want to be working with an agency which is registered under the WSIB. And finally, the financial implications. There's an upfront fee of $750 per license. There's a letter of credit that's required so that if there's ever an order to pay, for example, it comes out of the credit instrument and there's no more chasing down an errant supplier. There's a $25,000 letter of credit that's required. If you're an organization like Adecco, for example, which provides temporary and permanent recruitment services, you need a separate license for each, and we'll need to provide 2 letters of credit. And last but not least, the fines. These are the fines for not only an agency which operates without a license, but also organizations and companies who knowingly use an agency or recruiter that's not licensed. You'll want to make doubly sure the agency you're using is licensed for the services that you're accessing. So if you're using an agency for both temporary staffing and permanent recruitment, you'll want to make sure that they have 2 licenses, one for each of those things. The question that I know is burning in your minds right now is, how will you know who's licensed and who's not? Well, the government's thought about that. There is a link actually to a public portal that's already gone live that will give access to information about who's applied for which type of license, what the status of the application is, and who the contact is for that agency or recruiter. And the barcodes are up on the screen for quick access to that link. And with that, I will end there. That's the substance of the regulation. It's not all that complicated, but it's very impactful and very meaningful. But I do want to open it up if anyone has any discussions, any comments, or any questions.
We've got one question that's come in, Nicolette, is what is the DNOs?
What is which?
The DNOs.
Oh, I'm sorry. Directors and officers.
Yeah.
I apologize. Yeah, directors and officers of an organization.
Okay, great. Thank you. Quick question as well. So some people may be asking, whose responsibility is it to ensure a company is licensed? Is it does the company using the company, is it their responsibility to go and source this information out, or the agency to provide that information to their client?
So the agency, that's not actually covered in the regulations. It's actually a good point. The agency doesn't have to provide its license to a client to be able to show it. So it's really, I guess, the onus is on the client to do their due diligence. So they can actually ask the agency for a copy of the license, which is my recommendation. But they can also easily go onto this public portal to check for themselves. They don't have to rely on getting a certificate. They can just simply key in the supplier name, and it pops up, and they can check to see, just verify that they're licensed.
So we highly recommend that's the process that any client would go through, their own due
Totally.
diligence. Okay.
Totally.
Great.
And John, you and I both know how many audits we go through, clients who double check and are asking us for information, of course. And I always applaud it. They want to make sure pay stubs and, all the things are in order. I think this will take a lot off individual clients to actually ask for all that information. It eliminates that obligation, and they can just zip onto this portal, make sure it's in compliance. It also shows you if a license has been revoked. Over time. Right now, people are in application mode, but over time, it'll show whose license has been revoked.
And can you see if someone has applied and not been approved?
It says right now, I popped on yesterday, it says application in process. I think at some point they're going to start to, it's a 6-month lag to allow all these, hundreds of recruiters and to get their licenses in order. And I think it will say approved or not approved at some point.
Great. We have a question from our good friend Gord Betson. He's asked, is the process to apply open now?
Yes. As of July 1, it went live. We're gathering our own information together. As I mentioned, I gave you a little snippet of what's required, but there's a lot more required. So I think people will take a couple months to get their things in order and submit it, but you can definitely see some people. There are a couple of recruiters have already applied. They seem to be individuals who are in business for themselves.
And is much more in depth than just a form to fill out. Obviously, there's a lot.
Yeah. On my end, it's pretty laborious.
So it's like getting a Costco card or anything, right? It's again,
On my end, it's like a long process, but I welcome it. I think they're looking at all the right things. Of course, they want to make sure people are up to date on their taxes. They don't have any orders outstanding against them. If there is an order, what are you doing about it? So it's a really intense process, and they're gathering together what I think is the right information.
Terrific. We also had a question from Ted. Are we able to get a copy of this presentation to share with our teams? We are recording this right now. We're going to post it on our website, so you are able to go on there and take a look at it any time and show anyone else you want to show. That would be no problem at all. Tracy's asking, Tracy, if you have a question you want to type in now, you can. Feel free to type something in. We're taking questions.
One of the issues that the Ministry of Labor was faced was they did a blitz, that's about 18 months ago, and they found that something like $9 million in orders was outstanding to workers who hadn't been paid properly, who had, a number of payments and obligations outstanding to them. And one of the things was, how do they get money? How do they force employers to pay these orders? And that was a real problem for them. So this letter of credit is a really interesting idea. So they're getting the money up front. And if there's an order, they'll pull it out from the letter of credit. And then the employer or the agency will have to top up their letter of credit in order for their license to remain in good standing. So it's actually a clever way to make sure that employees are getting the payments that they're entitled to.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have a question as well from Bev. Is the license renewed each year, or just a one-time application, and is there an expiry date on it?
That's a great question. I actually don't know. In some of the other provinces, like, for example, Quebec just also recently, last year, initiated something, and you can apply for 2-year periods. And I haven't seen that yet here, if it's whether it's annually or if you can go for longer increments, but it'll definitely expire at some point. The government wants to keep getting renewed information and make sure that the information is current, like WSIB standing, super key. So I expect there'll be an expiry period.
So here's a longer question for you, Lupita. As you know, some agencies provide temporary help with a different flavor, like contingent, project-based, fractional positions, or interim roles, with a duration that can even be longer than 12 months. In many cases, more senior roles. Can you explain how the buyout and placement fees will be affected by this legislation?
There will be no impact on that at all. So that buyout fee legislation is in place in Ontario. It's the only province actually across Canada that has that restriction of the 6 months. But this is completely unrelated to any of the existing regulations. This is simply a regulatory mechanism like driver's license. To get a license, it doesn't impact any of the driving laws. They still remain in place. It's whether a particular person is allowed to conduct their business. And so that's what this licensing regime is like.
Sorry, I stumbled a little, Peter, because while I was reading, my screen was moving. So I apologize for that. Question from Adele. Other than ensuring that agencies have a license, are there any other requirements on the employer side?
No, not with this legislation. This legislation is all about getting licensed. So there's nothing else that's actually impacted the Employment Standards Act. There's nothing that employers need to do differently. This is about making sure employers are actually following the law. So the law hasn't changed. It's a mechanism just to make sure there's compliance. So you can look at it that way.
So I have a question from Tracy. If you have contract recruiters that are paid by the hour to directly hire for your company, does this include them?
No. So contract recruiters paid by the hour. That's interesting. So if you mean an independent contractor, so that's definitely a carve out an exemption for employees of an organization if you're hiring internally. If you're on contract, I would imagine this would be captured by this. You're recruiting, and that contract recruiter is kind of in business for themselves. And this is exactly who I think the government wants regulated, is these individuals who are in business by themselves. But also, they want to make sure that those are being compliant. So I would imagine that contract recruiter would also need to be licensed. One of the indicia of being a contractor is that you're entitled to have multiple clients. That's one of the distinguishing factors from an employee relationship, right? So independent contractors should be in business for themselves and contracting for as many clients as they want. So that would be captured by this definition.
And a similar question came in from Neil as well. He was asking, do HR consultants who occasionally support clients with recruitment support have to apply for a license? So if they,
so.
I would think so.
Yeah, I think so. This is what they do. They recruit. So they'll need a license. And, that's one of the things we grappled with at the Ministry of Labor when we had our working sessions is how onerous would it be, to get a $25,000 letter of credit. We didn't, the ministry definitely is conscious of knocking out small business owners and making sure, they're not being penalized, and also by the penalties, making sure the penalties were sufficient size to be a detriment, a deterrent to the behavior, but also manageable for a small organization. And this is where the government landed.
I guess another question would be, do we see any additional regulations coming up front? Are there any talks or any negotiations or any more consultation with Access about additional legislation or additional changes to the ESA?
Not in Ontario. This was a big one. This was we've been lobbying and talking about this for a long time. So not in Ontario. Ontario's done a fair bit in the last 10 years for the temporary staffing agency. There was a time where in the US, they have this concept called at-will employment. And you could employ an employee at will, so terminate them without giving them notice. And there used to be a time where temporary workers were called at will, and they weren't given the same protections as other employees would be. So the government eliminated that status of at will employment. They used to call them elect to work employees. So slowly over, I'd say the last 10, 12 years, they've eliminated all those, false distinctions. Employees are employees and are worthy of all the same protections. So I think there's a lot of heavy lifting been done, and I'm not aware of any that's being contemplated right now.
Yeah, it's funny because that really started to change around 2009 after we saw all the challenges of 2007 and 2008.
Yeah.
And it seems now coming out of the challenges we had in 2021 and
Yes.
through the pandemic, we're now seeing changes coming on the other side. So it's interesting how those difficult times kind of breed these challenges.
And it's funny, John, just about 3 months ago, there's a regulation that passed that you're not allowed to hold an employee's passport. And I read it and I thought, well, who does that? And I guess people, there are agencies that do it. So that's the type of legislation that's still trickling out. but I'm not aware of any right now.
Just another quick question from Ted, just a clarification. He's to understand the process. Nothing needs to be done on the employer side. We need to be sure that agencies are licensed, if I'm understanding correctly. And that is correct, Ted. Yes. So, I mean, the due diligence that belongs on your side is just to ensure that that licensing is in place.
Exactly. There's nothing clients need to do, take active steps, other than ensure the agencies they use are licensed.
So one more question from Isabel. When outsourcing recruitment services, should the company now run this research to make sure that the agency has a license? Is it not enough to have the provision that the contract agency complies with all regulations? If the research is a must, should we save the results to prove that we have done our due diligence?
Isabel, you know what it comes down to is if you're using an unlicensed recruiter, you're subjecting the organization to a fine. And the fines are steep, it can be up to $50,000. I think it's a super quick search to go on. It literally takes a minute to go on, tick the box. So you can put it in the contract. I don't know how, to be honest, I don't know how the ministry would see that. If you still risk having a fine applied to you, having that in the contract. I would imagine they'd say you could have done the search and you should have done the search just to ensure, and they'll levy the fine. So for me, as a legal advisor advising an organization, I would say not enough to be in the contract. It should be in the contract, but not enough. And I'd do a quick search if I were in procurement or in HR, getting ready to use a supplier.
Terrific. And I'm not a lawyer, but I believe the ESA kind of trumps all contracts.
Exactly. You're exactly right.
Yeah, I should have been a lawyer.
Right? You've learned well, John.
Yes. Quick question from Tyler. For the employer that handles recruiting in-house, does the legislation apply, or is it just if we are sourcing out the recruitment?
Yeah, great question, Tyler. That's actually an exemption. So if you're an employee in a company recruiting for the company, you're absolutely carved out. No license is required. This is just for external entities, external parties that do this service for a third party, for a client.
Terrific. We have 6 more minutes. Are there any more questions? Anyone again that wants to go to our site and pick this recording up and show it to any other people within your organization, your company, please do. I have one more question here coming in last minute. 1 second. From Gail, does an agency need one license? Sounds like our small group of 10 independent contractor recruiters will need an individual license, 10 licenses. Is this correct? It will know us. So it was basically there are 10 independent contract recruiters in one company. Do each of them need a license, or do they individual?
So we talked about that, not this particular scenario, but we talked about that in our working sessions. So recruiters, like I'll take Adecco for an example. We have recruiters who are working. We wouldn't need multiple licenses for each of those recruiters and the organization. We just need the one license. I think if you're an independent contractor, you're seen as a separate business, a separate legal entity. I assume you're an incorporated independent contractor. I believe the ministry will see you in business on your own and each of you will need individual licenses. I would check in with the ministry though and see if there's something there, if they can provide some guidance. My hunch is that you'll need separate ones if you're independent contractors and not employees of an organization, but I would double check with the ministry and get their thoughts.
One really good question coming in from Peter here. How about considering a staffing firm that's located outside of Ontario but still offering recruitment services to Ontario employers?
Yeah, Peter, need a license. So regardless of where the recruiter or the temporary help agency sits, it's irrelevant. If the recruitment is being done, if an Ontario employee is being recruited, then the license is required.
And if a person's recruiting in Ontario for BC or for Quebec, who also have licensing requirements, then you would need licensing in each province.
Yeah, and just to be clear, not all provinces have licensing. So BC does, Alberta does, Quebec, as of last year, implemented a regime, and now Ontario. And so those are the only provinces right now.
Terrific. Okay. it seems to be all the questions we have right now. But again, anyone would like to reach out to ask additional questions, we were always happy to do that. And if you want to have this uh, download this recording and play it to anyone else, please do so. That'd be great to do. I know that we are all collectively hoping that this legislation does what it was intended to do, and that is help those individuals that are currently being taken advantage of, and really helps to ensure we're building a solid, legal, and responsible employment forum for everybody. So we appreciate everyone participating today and coming together. Um, Please let us know if you had any more. But we thank you very much for your time and hope you have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. All the best.
Take care. Bye.